This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and a while back, the subject of Lyndon LaRouche came up in an interview, and then I had some questions about this guy whom I've heard about, this shadowy political figure in the Democratic Party, and I really didn't know a lot about him, but I did read some of him in a Webster Tarpley book, and that just created more questions for me. But a listener emailed me and suggested that I interview Tom Weiss. Now, Tom has been on the Visigoth show from the Grassy Knoll, and I understand that Tom is the guy who has all the answers about Lyndon LaRouche. So, Tom, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
And you have also with us today your pastor, Reverend Demetrius Carolina?
That's right. He's right next to me, or in front of me.
Now, Tom, do you have a website also?
Yes, I do. I publish a paper called Upfront News, which is quite well known. It's available in print and on the Internet, and the website or the blog site is www.tomsupfrontnews.blogspot.com, and Tom's Upfront News is one word without an apostrophe. I also have another website that was active and remains active from the period of time last year and the year before, when I was a Democratic write-in candidate for the Senate against Hillary Clinton, in which the LaRouche people, by the way, played a rather negative role, which we can talk about.
Yeah.
And that website or blog site was www.tomweissdemocrat4USSenate.blogspot.com, and Weiss is spelled with two S's, and there are no dots between the U and the S in U.S. Senate for, website access. So those are my websites, and there's a good deal of information about the LaRouche angle and other things on both of those sites. But my paper is called Upfront News, and I'm the publisher.
Okay. Now, as I told you in an email correspondence with you, in the 1980s, way back when, I used to see, when election time came around, I would see pamphlets and whatnot for Lyndon LaRouche, and you never heard about him on TV. And then when I later read a book by Webster Tarpley called The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush, that's Daddy Bush, I was really impressed with the book, except for I was really scratching my head, because according to Webster Tarpley in that book, as I said, he has Lyndon LaRouche as some kind of cross between Superman and Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, he really admires this LaRouche guy. So just who is Lyndon LaRouche?
Okay, I'll be glad to answer that, and I'll answer it first since you mentioned Tarpley's name. Tarpley is also fairly well known to me. Tarpley is certainly a devotee of Lyndon LaRouche, although the one opportunity that I had to talk to Webster Tarpley when he came to speak at St. Mark's in the Bowery Church in Manhattan, which is the sanctuary, so to speak, for a basically Lyndon LaRouche operation called 9/11 Truth. I discussed that at some length on the Visigoth show. Tarpley was a guest speaker there. They are believers in one version of a conspiracy theory. I don't think it's so much of a theory that there were high-level government officials who were aware of the 9/11 disaster before it actually occurred. As far as the LaRouche angle is concerned, Lyndon LaRouche, and you can check his website, is a master and has been for many, many years, and I'm not the only source, I'll give you some others, on the politics of camouflage. Lyndon LaRouche is notorious for his dramatic shifts from the way out radical right to the radical left, and simultaneously working with both extremes simultaneously. In recent years, let me just get to the contemporary situation, then go back over the history. In recent years, as the Bush administration has sort of been decomposing in public, in large part because of the Iraq disaster, LaRouche has once again returned to some of his radical left roots, which he honed during his early years as a Trotskyite and a communist, etc. Very involved in the anti-war demonstrations during the Vietnam era. He latched on to Maoist groups, etc., and vented his anger against more small-d democratic leftists. In recent years, he has managed to infiltrate quite heavily various, quote, left groups, such as 9/11 Truth, such as the Green Party, such as World Can't Wait. And let me just, mention one more thing and then, ask me further. One of the ways that Mr. LaRouche works, in part because his public record is a disaster. He was convicted of credit card fraud back in the 80s in a highly publicized trial, went to federal penitentiary for years. He has known links to the mob and to fascists and all sorts of people. One of the ways that this man has to work out of necessity, he only recently got off parole, is through surrogates. One of his principal surrogates is a very well-known figure in New York. Her name is Lenora Fulani. She's an African-American woman who came to some fame as a so-called populist, preaching black nationalism, etc. She works closely with a Jewish man by the name of Fred Newman. Together they created something called social therapy. I don't have to mince my words. She's an out-and-out anti-Semite. She became notorious when she was overheard making a comment that the Jews en masse are responsible for the murders of people of color en masse. That got her into trouble, although she retains her political influence. With Mayor Bloomberg, for example, she helped elect him. At any rate, the LaRouche-Fulani collaboration is a matter of record, although if you ask Ms. Fulani about it, she will either become silent or say it's not true. One of the best sources, and let me mention this and then you can please go on to your follow-up question. One of the best sources on this subject is an investigative reporter who I'm surprised is not as well known as he should be. His name is Dennis King. Dennis King, some years ago, back in the 1980s, wrote a very unauthorized biography of Mr. LaRouche. It's called The New American Fascism. It's on the website. You can check out www.dennisking.org. I've met Mr. King. It was partly through me that he became interested in Lenora Fulani, and definitely through me that he became interested in Fulani's literal takeover of the Green Party in New York during the Nader candidacies. I was a former supporter of Ralph Nader's, but I moved away from him as I saw this takeover actually occur. At any rate, so the important thing that I'm trying to stress here is that LaRouche, if you read his website or if you read his literature now, denouncing the war, calling for the impeachment of Bush, many leftists would say this guy's not so bad. And what he basically does is by infiltrating the left through the Greens, extracting political violence against people who disagree with him, such as myself. I've been a target of it. He's been doing this for years. Creates friction within the left, splits up the left, which in fact helps the right. It is classic fascist political tactics. One of the primary advocates, as a matter of fact, the person who conceived that strategy, which is very different than conservative strategy, which is the left, fascist political theory impersonates the left. If we think back to Adolf Hitler, we have to recall that Adolf Hitler campaigned as a socialist, as a nationalist socialist. He tailored his appeal to the working class. He denounced the capitalists. And then, of course, at the appointed moment, he murdered the communists. Very similar to the way the LaRouche people operate. They direct most of their venom against small d democratic progressives such as myself, and they mount pseudo-candidacies. They sucked in Ralph Nader. He had no idea what was going on. They have their infiltrators in the Democratic Party. Lyndon LaRouche is a registered Democrat, okay? He's run for president umpteen time. He never gets any votes. But then he works through others. So there are people, he even has his people in the John Edwards campaign, etc., a guy by the name of Charles Lenchner. So anyway, I can go on, but that's sort of the picture. I'm trying to present LaRouche as, even though he's in his 80s and is regarded as some kind of a crackpot out of the 80s, he's certainly a crackpot, but he's a skillful one. He's an extremely articulate man. He's a recognized authority on classical music. His store, if he still has it down there in Leesburg, Virginia, is known as the Beethoven Shop. I often make a joke that Beethoven was a genius who, as you know, continued composing symphonies after he became deaf, and my joke about that is if Beethoven ever had to listen to Lyndon LaRouche, he would wish he was deaf. But he retains his influence. The important name to remember certainly is Lenora Fulani, whose influence in New York remains. Laura Fulani, by cutting a deal with Mayor Bloomberg back in 1981, agreed when she was the dictator of the Independence Party of New York, agreed to endorse Michael Bloomberg Middleburg, when he was running for mayor in a mostly Democratic city, the 30 or 40,000 votes that he got on the Independence Party line enabled him to be elected, okay? And boy, did he reward her after that, gave her all sorts of tax breaks, okay? And she did it again in 2005, okay? I've discussed this with Al Sharpton. I've discussed this with Charles Barron and many African-American leaders, because she always presented herself as the voice of African-Americans, okay? And she collaborates with this guy, Fred Newman. We could talk about Fred Newman for hours. I mean, basically, the guy's a cultist. So, and their infiltration is quite deep into the Greens, into so-called World Can't Wait. They are hopping on the impeachment campaign, which is going to go nowhere. And they're all over the place. So, and certainly very much, and that's the thing that got me started with Keith on the Vizikov show, and he asked me some very good questions about that, was their infiltration into the 9/11 truth movement.
Oh, yeah.
Some serious validity, because I think there are major questions. There are also some unanswered questions about what Dick Cheney was doing, both during and before that disaster. I have to believe that Dick Cheney did know something, and that the so-called investigation was a sham.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when Cheney had to be chained at the hip when they were questioned. They had to be in the same room together. But the whole thing has been basically hijacked by the LaRouche people, and Webster Tarpley is one of them. Let me finish with this. On the day that Tarpley came down to speak at St. Mark's Church, I was literally the previous meeting physically barred at the door. There was a man by the name of Jeffrey Blank, a LaRoucheite, who had threatened me, and they wouldn't let me in the room when Blank came to speak. But on the day that Tarpley came to speak, he was very articulate, kind of avuncular, etc., and he spoke, basically giving the LaRouche line. And during the question and answer, I asked him, I said, Mr. Tarpley, I hear what you're saying, etc., but I note there's a remarkable similarity in your views with those of Lyndon LaRouche. And he sort of hemmed and hawed. At that point, a man by the name of Les Jameson, who runs the 9/11 Truth, physically tried to remove me from the mic and then uttered a threat, you better keep your mouth shut about all this stuff.
Oh, wow.
So I remember in our email exchange, you said something like, holy smokes, these guys are real thugs, and they are. LaRouche has always been an advocate of the use of carefully selected political violence against dissenters, and I have been one of his major targets. I've been a victim of a politically motivated attack in which this guy Jeffrey Blank was involved. This guy by the name of Paul Zulkowitz in the Green Party was made death threats against me. There's a whole bunch of people. So that's the way they operate. But they spout a left-wing line, and they pick up a lot of adherents with it. So that'll give you some of a sense that LaRouche is not old hat. He's very contemporary, and he certainly, his influence in the Nader campaign, as far as I'm concerned, played a major role in the wind-up of the 2000 and 2004 elections. The entire strategy, I think, was by splitting up the left, by weaning a small portion of the left away to the Nader candidacy, basically weaning enough votes away that would, in fact, help, even while they denounced the Bush people, would help the Bush people come in, which are setting off precisely the kind of conditions, the social and economic conditions. When the right comes in, social conditions deteriorate. Racism goes up, crime goes up, war goes up, everything, housing becomes totally unaffordable, and those are the conditions that fascists use in order to advance. The classic case example is the Weimar Republic in Germany. When after World War I, the Allies decided to basically obliterate Germany, and the people who paid for it, of course, were the disenfranchised poor, or the working class, and those are the people that Hitler made his appeal to, and that's how he got himself elected. And I think LaRouche still has a dream that somehow he is going to take power.
Oh, wow. I was taken aback. I was taken aback, frankly, on a interview, just in an off-the-cuff remark. The Visigoth, Keith, he referred to the LaRoucheites in a recent interview a couple months ago, but he referred to them just as gangsters, and I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty strong language. But the kind of stuff you're describing, strong-arm tactics, ooh.
Absolutely. If you go, what I would suggest that you access Dennis King. His biography of LaRouche is amazing. I've recommended it to Reverend Carolina and many other people. And as a matter of fact, the book is actually online. But if you go to DennisKing.org, you'll get access to the book. It describes the history of it. He's really a rather remarkable man, And his links don't just simply extend to the left. They extend to the way-out radical right. This is the only person in history who, for example, could simultaneously carry on private, or he thought they were private, discussions with the Ku Klux Klan and with the Malcolm X hating black Muslims. I personally believe, and I have no real hard proof, I'm quite certain that LaRouche was somehow involved in the assassinations of Malcolm X and Dr. King.
Wow.
There is no question that he had links with that portion of the black Muslim movement that hated and wanted to see Malcolm X murdered. I feel the same way, and those things never. LaRouche also, this is also a very important thing to mention, which I almost overlooked. LaRouche is a registered Democrat, and he usually spends his time railing against the Republicans, especially now that the Republicans are just basically morally completely bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
However, he has links to the Republicans. Ronald Reagan gave him an audience, okay? There's a picture of him sitting there and talking with Reagan. In May 5th, 2005, in the so-called gossip section of the New York Times, it's a little column, it's called Bold Print or Boldface or something like that. Lyndon LaRouche was a guest at the dinner, the annual dinner put on by the White House Press Association, which is at the White House, and only all sorts of celebrities, left and right. Jane Fonda was there, the whole neocon establishment in there, and who shows up but Lyndon LaRouche? All right, I just hope Jane Fonda didn't have to sit at his table. Etc. And that's incredible. You do not get invited to an event where Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld sit, and LaRouche is sitting there. This guy's a convicted felon. LaRouche also has known ties, and the better source on this would be Dennis. He has known ties to the international drug trafficking conspiracy. He has known ties to the Chinese Communist regime, which is one of my more than pet peeves, because the Communist Chinese regime is involved in genocide around the world. They've been practicing genocide in Tibet now since 1949. Nobody wants to talk about it because everybody's got money tied up in China, including Hillary Clinton, including Rupert Murdoch, etc. They were also responsible for the Khmer Rouge disaster, which killed almost 2 million Cambodians. I've read some of the Chinese Communist websites. He's been a guest lecturer at some of their events in California. He's also known to have links to the mob, okay? So he is basically a gangster. He also is a believer. He is very, very clear. He is a believer that government is to be conducted by what he calls a vanguard, or an elite. The Chinese Communists call it a vanguard. He calls it an elite, where there is a select few that are considered to be intellectually superior and born to rule. He considers himself one of them. Adolf Hitler considers himself one of them, and there's something to be said for that. You can accuse these people of being diabolical, racist. He's an out-and-out racist, okay? He has spewed venom about black people, but he hires them. That's how he works with somebody like Fulani, okay? But he considers himself as part of this intellectual elite, and he has managed through the use of all sorts of polysyllabic lectures and stuff like that about 15th century astronomers and all this other stuff to convince a small cult of people that he is in fact some kind of a genius, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That part, you every once in a while you go to an airport and you see some people with sitting at LaRouche tables with funny pictures. Those people don't bother me because they're out there. The ones that scare me are the ones that infiltrate. The people like Paul Zilkowitz, a very smooth, who got himself deep into the peace movement and became a close personal friend of Ralph Nader, okay? People like this guy Jonathan Ticini, who was a Senate candidate. A guy named Charles Lenchner, who's the head of something called the Progressive Democrats for America, which is a very respected progressive group, okay? I suspected it all along because he once pushed me around when I was running for Senate. And sure enough, he was an interviewer for LaRouche's magazine, which is called the Executive Intelligence Review. So that's the danger. Yes, and they are thugs, because when they don't like you, they go after you, and they will kill you. I can tell you there are two cases that anybody should start looking up. One is the case of a man by the name of Jeremiah Duggan, a young Jewish man who got involved with the LaRoucheites in Europe. Okay, apparently something didn't work out. One day he was run over by a car. I think it was in Holland. They called it a suicide. That was no suicide. Nobody has yet looked into the circumstances of the death of a man by the name of Dan Wallace, a 21-year-old fellow who used to attend the 9/11 Truth meetings down at St. Mark's Church in Manhattan, okay? And I met Mr. Wallace because he witnessed some of the harassments against me there. And one day, outside the church, when I was physically barred from entering the church, he interviewed me on a video thing. And as soon as I mentioned LaRouche, he said, "LaRouche, those people have been after me for years, okay?" And he took a quick interview. 2 weeks later, they found him dead in his bed, okay? The official story was drug overdose. Nobody is talking about that, okay? This is a young man of 21 years old, no known drug problem. I talked to his girlfriend once, okay? So the evidence here is circumstantial, okay? I can also tell you that because there's clear evidence that some of the assaults and attacks against me were politically motivated, of course, I reserve my right as a citizen to use law enforcement to protect me. And the police department is aware of some of these matters. The FBI is aware of some of these matters. And if you mention Lyndon LaRouche's name to the FBI, they get very, very interested because he's a convicted felon. So, anyway, but again, what I want to stress is that as much of a crackpot as he's ruined as something out of the 1980s, he remains contemporary. If you read his website, this guy is dead set on setting up a situation in which the divisions of this country are of such an acute nature that somebody will call, "We need a leader to clean all this up," and he will then come riding in on his little horse from Leesburg, Virginia, a short helicopter ride, okay? He has known links to the radical right. I see something like that movie called 7 Days in May, which has the fictionalized account of a right-wing coup, charismatic Air Force general played by Burt Lancaster in the film. LaRouche sees himself in that role. LaRouche is also a known worshiper of things German. Okay, I got nothing against Beethoven and the Germans, but this man has actually called for the elimination of all kinds of indigenous music, folk, rock, gospel, etc. Okay, he won't talk about that in public, but he's on record with that, and that the only kind of music worth listening to is German classical music. He does that through something called the Schiller Institute. Schiller was, I think, a German poet or something like that, and that's based in Europe. The Schiller Institute is what gives us Webster Tarpley, okay, who is a major figure in the Schiller Institute. That's Schiller. So, anyhow, any more questions?
Well, Tom, you mentioned that...
I'm still... Okay.
You mentioned, Tom, that Lyndon LaRouche got an audience with Ronald Reagan, and that reminds me of something Webster Tarpley had written in his book. He said in the 1979-1980 New Hampshire campaign, LaRouche exposed Daddy Bush's CFR and Skull and Bones ties, and then he harmed Bush. He took away a lot of votes, apparently, from him, says Tarpley. But then Reagan took up this issue, and that's why Bush lost New Hampshire. And he says LaRouche called Daddy Bush a cult-ridden kook. And anyway, do you think maybe there was a deal, a backdoor deal between Reagan and LaRouche? What do you think?
Very, very possible. It's anything with LaRouche is possible. I mean, you deal with the devil, you deal with the devil, okay? What I think is central here is that in LaRouche's continuing attacks on the Bush administration, he was among the people, first of all, who started yapping about impeaching Bush. My feeling is, by the way, that I think Bush, a whole bunch of them probably belong in jail, but if you're going to impeach somebody, go for Cheney. Bush, which is not going to happen, you wind up with Cheney, okay, which to me would even be worse.
Yeah.
And when I began writing about that, all of a sudden, LaRouche's people started talking about the same thing. So, but my feeling is that the attacks on the Bush regime, even though in many ways they are factually somewhat correct, although they always twist something around, that they're opportunistic, okay? They're opportunistic because they're basically capitalizing on the implosion of the Bush regime. But what they do simultaneously with that is while they attack the conservatives, which is exactly what Adolf Hitler did, he blasted away at the conservatives. He splits up the left. And the way they do that, it's a very skilled technique. They out-left the left. Whatever the left happens to be, whether it's a moderate Democrat, relative to the conservative right, whether it's a moderate Democrat like Kerry or Gore, or a more socialistically oriented thing, or somebody like myself who ran as a left progressive in the Democratic Party, they will out-left that person, thereby creating an inevitable split. The more you split the whole thing up, the more the right advances.
Yeah.
That's the technique, you know?
Yeah.
And they continue. Of course, one of the main vehicles of that operation has been the Greens. You know, the Greens also basically helped elect Mayor Bloomberg. They insisted, even though they were asked, please don't run another candidate, they ran this guy Gronowitz, who got just a couple of thousand votes, and basically those votes came from the Democrats, and thereby Bloomberg was perfectly happy. You know, and nobody can tell me that LaRouche is legitimately anti-Bush when he accepts accepts a dinner invitation to attend the White House press conference dinner and sits probably at the same table with Wolfowitz and then the whole Bush bunch and Condoleezza Rice and stuff like that.
Now that's odd.
It's not odd. It's not odd from the LaRouche perspective. LaRouche perspective, you go wherever you can. It's the ultimate form of opportunism. Okay? Something, by the way, that I also consider, although not quite as overtly fascistic, I also consider Hillary Clinton guilty of. And I talk about opportunism. This lady runs around saying she's a progressive and takes money from Rupert Murdoch. Give me a break. But LaRouche is really, and that's what makes him kind of unique, you know, this man who is able to appeal to the most radical elements on both sides, you know, and still maintain his status as an enrolled Democrat. What he does every year, he runs for president, he'll probably do it again, and then at the last minute, realizing, as he's realized all along, that he has no chance of being elected, he throws his support to. He endorsed Kerry, he endorsed Gore. I'm sure they were absolutely thrilled with that. And that's the game he plays, you know.
Let me ask you, you said he was in jail for credit card fraud in the 80s.
Yep.
And now, according to Webster Tarpley again, they were, I believe he makes the point that they were trumped-up charges. But one thing he says is there was an illegal raid carried out on LaRouche's home, and it was Bush's payback for what LaRouche did to him in New Hampshire in 79 and 80. Any truth?
This is the same Webster Tarpley who, by the way, when I asked him, he said he doesn't have anything further to do with Lyndon LaRouche. So that speaks for Webster Tarpley. What happened, as far as I'm aware, I did not read the entire transcript of the trial. It's a very highly publicized trial. It took place in Boston. LaRouche, through his skills as a very highly placed activist in the Democratic Party, managed to befriend wealthy Democratic Party-connected widows, etc., okay, and through various means was able to get access to their credit card accounts. Stole millions, okay? I know several people from whom he stole money, okay?
Wow.
And what happened was, apparently because of his previous links to the KKK, which had been heavily infiltrated by the FBI, to the black Muslims, the Elijah Muhammad black Muslims, to the Communist Party, to the Trotskyites, the FBI was already on his tail. So it wasn't that difficult for somebody to get a court order to tap his lines. And they did. They tapped his lines. The act of literally ripping off money. And so he was indicted on mail fraud and credit card fraud, and apparently there was overwhelming evidence. He was convicted, and then what happened after he was convicted, he was also almost convicted on something else. He had infiltrated the NBC News organization. He also had managed to infiltrate Daniel Moynihan's campaign and political organization when Moynihan was a senator. And when the Moynihan people found out about it, of course, they got rid of them all, and he responded with threats. And then the NBC News and Washington Post wrote about it, and he responded with threats there, etc. So, I mean, if it shows what Tarpley's about if he's claiming that LaRouche was a political prisoner.
Oh, it's all through his book. He calls him Bush's man in the iron mask. It makes a real martyr out of him.
Well, martyrdom would be too good for this guy, okay? So,
wow.
Yeah. It's very interesting because I remember when I talked to Tarpley, he immediately in that setting tried to distance himself from LaRouche. So, and Tarpley, by the way, it's important, Tarpley is a major icon in the so-called 9/11 Truth Movement, which is led by two characters, by the way, both of whom have threatened me. One is this guy, Les Jameson. You can interview him, but he probably won't talk to you. Les Jameson, who is the self-appointed leader of so-called 9/11 Truth. Nobody ever elected this guy. And then there is, and this should be of interest to anybody of the cloth, the other is so-called Pastor Frank Morales. Pastor Frank Morales is the assistant pastor at the St. Mark's in the Bowery Church, which is nationally known for not only its political activism, but also is very involved with the art world. I spent January 1st there attending the annual poetry marathon at St. Mark's, which features big stars like Patti Smith and all sorts of other people. It's a great event. But it's also basically the sanctuary for this group. Frank Morales claims to be a preacher. I don't know who ordained this guy, but this guy he's mixed up with that whole bunch. He's made several threats against me. I don't like making police complaints against pastors, but I have to do it to him. There's also these are the guys who run that thing, and these are the guys who decided, which was their right, to invite Webster Tarpley to speak at their event. And when upon discovering, as I do my research, that Tarpley was directly linked to LaRouche, I went over to Mr. Jameson, and I said, Tarpley is a LaRouche guy. Now, if you want to invite him, that's fine with me, but don't you think the people in the group should be made aware of that? This is what Jameson said to me. He said, you better keep your mouth shut about that. Okay? I take that as a threat. And then the next time when Tarpley showed up, it was Jameson who tried to push me from the mic, and it was Frank Morales who tried to push me around, okay? So somebody ought to interview. I don't know if these guys are going to talk to you. They've tried everything to keep me away from the media. And I talked to a lot of reporters. There are people here who are finally starting to look into this. There's a guy at NBC News, a friend of mine, who is both a Democratic Party activist and who saw the threats coming down against me when I was involved with the Nader thing. He works for NBC News, and I hope he can get Brian Williams to do something about it. Why? Because I think, as extreme as this man is, he has an effect on national politics. He's having an effect now. He's got his people in the John Edwards campaign. He's got his people in the Dennis Kucinich campaign. My feeling is that his effort is to try to split the Democratic Party into as many internecine combat groups as possible, which would thereby enable either Hillary Clinton to get the nomination, the most conservative Democrat, or enable the Republicans to get back in, which would then make things still worse. Wow. And, and lead to seems as his ultimate coming to power. So, but the 9/11 Truth Group, which is the main thing that I discussed on the Visigoth show, is a major arena of combat, a literal combat. I mean, I've been threatened there. I have photos of people literally threatening me there and stuff like that. So, and unfortunately, it's sad to say that it involves a minister. I call him Father Fraud myself. But and by the way, the Episcopal authorities I've made them aware of that. When the things became when Morales began threatening other people and stuff like that, and in light of more than passing rumors that Morales, who's a big name in the squatter community on the Lower East Side, was involved in drug trafficking, and I have some witnesses to that, etc. Of course, the law enforcement authorities became interested, and that's when I became still more of a threat. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It might be a conspiracy, but not of the sort that Lyndon LaRouche would want to talk about. But it's there. So anyway.
And how aware is Pastor Carolina of these things?
Well, Pastor Carolina, I have talked. He's not aware of all the details that I've talked to you about, although he's a reader of Upfront News, which carries a lot. When I talked to Pastor Carolina, and when I first mentioned to Pastor Carolina, I want him to speak for himself, was I mentioned LaRouche, and of course Pastor Carolina, as many others are not, was familiar with LaRouche, and he sort of said, oh my God, LaRouche, which is actually many people have, and then I fed him in some details. And then one day I asked him, well, do you teach fascist political theory in your political science course? He's a political science teacher, and he said no. And I said, I think you ought to think about doing that because I think it's very relevant now. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this with Pastor Carolina is because unlike many other ministers, he's a very politically knowledgeable man. He's also very active as a civil rights leader in Staten Island, and his sermons are spiritual and political, and he's not as aware of all the details, etc. But I think it's safe to say that Pastor Carolina is an anti-fascist, and that he's a progressive and he's a human rights guy, and but he doesn't know all the details, but he certainly can speak for himself on human rights and related issues. Yeah, and he's sitting next to me, by the way, so if you want to ask him anything, that's up to you.
Okay. Well, it's refreshing to hear a pastor who cares about politics, because traditionally the church was involved in politics, and today they're not. And the way I see it, That's how one. That's how.
But it comes to First Central Baptist. You know, it's very easy. Can you get to New York?
Yeah.
The trip to New York will cost you a little bit. The ferry is free.
Well, when the church abandons the field, that's how the world goes to hell in a handbasket. The church walks away from its responsibility.
I totally agree with your point,
Yeah.
Reverend Carolina speaking, and yes, the church does have a moral obligation to be the gadfly community. Certainly we should be the moral compass and the voice of society, and any pastor worth his weight in salt certainly knows that, and so certainly I support many of the efforts of Tom and Upfront News, and while I may not know the details and certainly may not be as radical, I certainly believe that truth, wherever it shines its light, should certainly be fed, nurtured, so that it can shine even brighter.
Let me add something to what Pastor Carolina said, even though it doesn't relate directly to the LaRouche thing. Staten Island is... I've been in Staten Island for about 5 years, making me possibly one of the few people who have now lived in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And while I find, you know, the civil rights activism of people like Reverend Carolina and some of the peace activists here very refreshing, it's also true that Staten Island, unfortunately, sadly, has been living up to something of a stereotype of being a bastion of some racism. There are a number of incidents recently here. I'm not going to go into the details on them. There was a young African-American kid who was found throwing eggs on Halloween, who literally was abducted by the police and dropped off in the wilds of Staten Island and threatened. There was a young man who made the mistake of jogging, a young African-American man who made the mistake of jogging into a white community leaning on some cars, got hell beaten out of him, and the law enforcement authorities are handling it all too gingerly, and it was Reverend Carolina who has been among those taking the leadership in what is now a more aroused, you know, African-American and progressive community in Staten Island, which is often seen as, oh, that's where all the Republicans are and that's where all the cops and firemen live. That's not necessarily true. So, and Pastor Carolina has been, at least to my way of thinking, one of the leaders. I met Pastor Carolina, by the way, just about almost exactly a year ago when the Martin Luther King celebration on the island, which brought all sorts of people, including the very well-known attorney Norman Siegel to First Central Baptist, had an event there, and that's when I first met Pastor Carolina, who is certainly very well known in the civil rights community. So, you know, even though maybe we come from somewhat different places, well, not entirely different places. I happen to, I'm a born Jewish person, but I was baptized many years ago in a major African-American church in Queens, pastored by Dr. Reverend Timothy Mitchell, whom you may or may not have heard of. Timothy Mitchell was a very close friend of Dr. King. He's now retired, and I got to know him when I was politically active in Queens, and I've joined Reverend Demetrius's church, in part because, not just because it's near my house, but also because I have absorbed Jesus as the ultimate in human rights activist, and I think people like Pastor Carolina live that out in the modern day. So it's not, you know, even though we may not always be talking about Lyndon LaRouche, we are. There are ministers that I can talk to about Lyndon LaRouche. I've talked to law enforcement people who said they never heard of the guy, you know, and that disturbs me. So I think it's very important that the name LaRouche become more visible. Let me just tell you, for example, I've been talking to my friend Charles. He's the guy who works at NBC News, and he's a very well-known political activist. He and I did some stuff together on the NATO campaign, and he saw the threats against me. This gentleman has been trying to convince some of the higher-ups at NBC News that there's a story here. The initial response, LaRouche is old hat. He's not old hat. So, anyhow, let me mention one other issue that relates to that. I mentioned it in sort of passing before. I don't know how much time we have left. I mentioned that LaRouche has a tight relationship with people high up in the Chinese Communist government, okay? I am not one of the, you know, visceral anti-communists, but what the Chinese have done to what Marx may have conceived of as communism is absolutely, it's the same thing that Hitler did to socialism. I've been deeply involved for many years, and LaRouche is exactly on the opposite side in the struggle to do something about what has been going on in Tibet. I'm not going to go into the full details, but that country is the victim of what has to be the longest-running genocide in the world, about which nobody is doing anything. Everybody's worked up about China, what it's been doing in Darfur, but everybody wants to keep quiet about Tibet, which is a similar issue because, as many people are not aware, the Tibetans are a black race. They are dark people, and that's one reason why they're being slaughtered by the light-complexion Chinese. In one of the other stories that I have written about, and it appears very, very circumspectly in the media because it has religious significance, is that there is, and this is one of the things why I think LaRouche is basically on the side of the devil. There is hard evidence. It's been written about by me, and it's been written about by a Christian popular theologian by the name of Elizabeth Clare Prophet, that during the so-called missing years in the Bible that are not, in which Jesus' whereabouts are not accounted for after the gospel and, before the other books, that he spent a good deal of time in Tibet. The Tibetan language derives from Aramaic, and all sorts of other things. And at any rate, I'm mentioning that sort of in the LaRouche context because LaRouche is one of those who's been most vocal in his advocacy of the wisdom of the Chinese government. And that, by the way, has some relevance to domestic politics. I've been talking to quite a number of people, most of whom still remain silent. I've discussed it with Al Sharpton. I've talked to Michelle Obama about it. I can tell you, and this will make it even more relevant, that a still little-known New York City councilman by the name of Tony Avella, who's now finally getting some of the exposure he deserves. He's a city councilman from Queens. He's a very strong tenants' rights guy, etc. And even though he's a Caucasian man, he's been very forceful on issues affecting African Americans. He's going to introduce a resolution into the city council calling for, citing the Tibet situation and calling for the removal of the Olympic Games from China. Now, a New York City Council resolution in of itself can't do a great deal. However, a resolution along those lines, which Hillary Clinton and her people will oppose, of course, in the New York City Council, which is the most important in the council, the most important city in the world, and the most important media-wise in the world, could generate similar actions in the United States Congress, okay? And that's a major issue because the Olympic Games is one of the biggest cash cows in history. And I always remind people, if you think the Olympic Games is just some kind of a sports thing, go back to 1936 Olympics, which were held at Hitler's Berlin.
Yeah.
It's the one where Jesse Owens became famous by leaving the German runners in the dust. By the way, the unspoken story about that Olympics is there was another runner. His name was Marty Glickman, who became a world-famous sportscaster. He was Jewish. And he was either the fastest or the second fastest man in the world. I don't know. When he ran against Jesse, I don't know who finished first. The deal cut between Adolf Hitler and Avery Brundage, the racist who ran the Olympic Committee at that time, was, okay, we're going to let Jesse run, but you're not going to have a Jew running in our Olympics. And Marty Glickman was never allowed to run.
I didn't know that.
We're replaying that same game again, and the victims are the Tibetans, okay? They're very quiet. I've met the Dalai Lama. I think it's an unspoken issue. I'm going to try to make it a spoken issue because genocide does not belong in this world today, and as far as I'm concerned, Lyndon LaRouche is an advocate of genocide.
Wow. Tom, what do you know about Webster Tarpley's writing partner, another LaRoucheite, Anton Chaikin?
Chaikin, yeah, it's like they're sort of Siamese twins. It's a good, yeah. I've read some of their stuff, and one of the things that Adolf Hitler advocated is he advocated the big lie. But he also advocated every once in a while you better tell the truth, because if you lie all the time, you're totally predictable and everybody's going to figure it out. LaRouche does the same thing. There is much in his literature and that of Chaikin's literature, and I've read it, that is truthful. Okay? There's no question, for example, that Bush was the skull and bones, the whole Yale bunch over there. He always intersperses certain facts and then distorts them in his own way. That's why it's important. There's some people who, if I talk about, I'm not going to read that guy's crap, something like that. And I say, it's very important to read your enemy, because if you don't read your enemy, you're probably not going to be aware, what he's doing.
Yeah.
But the thing about Satan is that he is the master of disguise, and LaRouche is one of those disguises. There's a book, by the way, which I haven't mentioned. You may have heard of this book, and I cannot remember the name of the author, but you might want to write it. It's called The People of the Lie. It's written by a secular man, and I can't remember the name of the author. It's available now you can get it at Barnes & Noble because it's just been reissued as a new publication. It talks about what it perceives of what is really the original sin, which is the use of the lie, which, you go right back to Genesis. The first stuff was the lie. Cain lying about what he did to Abel and all the other stuff, okay? Jacob and Esau, all these, the whole history of lying. And that is what Hitler was so great at. That's also what people like Tarpley and LaRouche are so good at, about lying, but mingling it with the truth, the Jews killed the blacks, Now, there are Jews who killed blacks. There were Jews who were there when Jesus was brought to Golgotha. There were Jews who were there, the Sanhedrin and all that other stuff. But it wasn't the Jews who killed Christ. You switch one word around, you switch one syllable around, and then you have basically created a racist generalization, And LaRouche is absolutely great at that, and Chaikin too. I've read them both. I mean, they're a team, But if you were to, I don't know, if you're going to interview them, they will probably, on the same thing that Fulani did. Fulani, for years, she was basically taught by LaRouche. The intermediary is a guy by the name of Dr. Fred Newman. Okay, Fred Newman claims to be a psychotherapist. He and LaRouche, back in the 1980s, created something called the New Alliance Party, which was so-called multi-ethnic populist party, which contaminated New York politics for years. They finally gave up the ghost after I started writing about them and stuff like that. And he was a Jew. And he was one of the people who talked about Jews as being guilty of the mass murders of people of color as his way to ingratiate himself with the black community. He was the one who brought us Lenora Fulani. Okay? So Fulani, by the way, is known in California. In L.A., there was a story. I hate the New York Post. I think it's a horrible paper, but they do pretty good coverage on Fulani. And a few months ago, there was a story about Fulani. Her fronts involved little services for children. She has something called the All-Star Project here in New York, which does all this stuff with the arts and with kids. And one day she was caught smacking some kids around, and of course it came out in the New York Post. And apparently something similar happened in Los Angeles sometime ago. Fulani must have a huge website, Look up New Alliance Party. There are other sources, by the way. As I said, Dennis King is one. A man by the name of Chip Berlet, B-E-R-L-E-T, who used to write for a paper called the Boston Phoenix, which was very much on to LaRouche and his people, because LaRouche used to live in Boston. He was raised in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire and Massachusetts. There's a guy by the name of Doug Ireland, I-R-E, like the country, who's written for The Nation magazine, who's done a lot of stuff on LaRouche, and he did some of the stuff on the LaRouche infiltration of the Nader operation. One of the people who might be willing to talk is one of Nader's closest friends, Patti Smith, the rock star. I saw her the other day at St. Mark's. She read some of her poetry there. She's very uncomfortable about this whole thing. She's a very close friend of Ralph Nader. And it was actually through her that I was able to get to Nader, because Nader won't talk about this. He will not talk about this. He was in New York. And basically the Nader operations, the last several candidacies were run by the Fulani people. They ran it. By the name of Kathy Sadell, a guy by the name of Paul Zilkowitz, etc. They basically took over the Greens. A guy named Howie Hawkins, and if you ask questions, you got threatened. As a matter of fact, when Ralph Nader, who was still talking to me because he and I agreed on Tibet and on the threat of the corporations, I was invited to a news conference that he had on April 29th to 30th in Madison Avenue, 2004. His press secretary, Kevin Zeese, invited me to his news conference. When I got there, I was physically assaulted in the lobby by this guy, George Tate Boseed, who had been sent downstairs by Fulani. She was upstairs with Nader. Make sure Weiss doesn't get into this interview. I was physically attacked on my way into the elevator. It was witnessed by a couple of people. That's the way these people deal. They are fascists. They're not conservatives. They're not liberals. They are fascists. There is a real presence, neo-fascist element in American politics, and the way it gets away with it is by disguising itself as leftists, just like good old Adolf.
Well, now that you mention that, the only audio interview I've ever heard of Lyndon LaRouche, and it was about 3 years ago on a so-called Patriot Radio Network. But I was listening to it, and I was intrigued listening to it. LaRouche said a lot of things that, constitutional, like a lot of things that like militia types would be in agreement with. But then in the middle, like he would go back and forth. He would then praise FDR, which is like anathema to conservative patriot militia type.
He's been doing that for years. You know, he is a registered Democrat. He started something called the National Committee of Labor Caucuses, which was a sort of left thing in the Democratic Party. He's been running around singing the praises of Roosevelt for years. You know, it's a camouflage. You also, people like Frank Morales, who likes to push people around who disagree with him, are always told. LaRouche has jumped on the so-called civil liberties bandwagon. You know, the suppression of which the Bush administration is supremely guilty, the suppression of free speech. You know, that's the whole thing. You camouflage yourself, you know, and he's been running around. If you see, I don't know if he has his tables. If you see one of his tables, I mean, he's all over the place. He's got a ton of webcasts. You will usually see a lot of literature about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's the scam. That's what makes him accessible. Okay, that's what makes him, this guy's not so bad. And then you'll see some other literature in which he calls for the impeachment of Bush and all this other stuff, you know. He also all of a sudden has become against capital punishment, although he would prefer to inflict that on some of his opponents. So, his scam on FDR has been, you know, for years. My thinking is if FDR knew that this guy was hopping on him, he'd probably manage to jump out of his wheelchair and start walking.
Now, the LaRouche, you mentioned they set up tables and distribute pamphlets. Do they do that at, like, college campuses?
Yes, they do it at college campuses. They've been known to do it at airports, and more recently they've been doing it at left-wing rallies. For example, good question. Last August, I got involved with a very interesting group called People's Organization for Progress, which set up it was called the Justice and Peace Coalition or something like that, based in Newark, New Jersey, led by a very, very effective man by the name of Larry Ham. I don't know, do you know Larry Ham? People's Organization for Progress, an anti-poverty human rights group based in Newark. Heavily African-American. I got involved with it because it was one of the few cases where you had a peace movement that was heavily African-American. In New York, the peace movement seems to be pretty much dominated by white liberals. In Newark, it's a little bit different. And I participated. They had a rally in downtown Newark on August 25th, and I participated in that. Sure enough, the LaRouche people, they started pushing their way in through various ways. They started coming to the meetings, and sure enough, at the rally, which had as its featured speaker, by the way, Congressman John Conyers, who is the point man in the whole impeachment question because he chairs the Judiciary Committee. And the LaRouche people came out in force, and they descended upon him like a pile of locusts, etc., demanding that he come out on the impeachment question. But they were all over the place. They were led by a man by the name of Dennis Speed, I believe, is the LaRouche people. And they are often to be seen. They are also directly connected through this guy Les Jameson with a group that I think it's a national group. They run full-page ads in all the major papers called World Can't Wait. Are you familiar with World Can't Wait?
No.
World Can't Wait is a radical left rhetoric network of people, which is national in character. It has a base in New York. I would be amazed if they don't have a base in California, which has run several full-page ads in the New York Times and in other major papers calling for the impeachment of Bush. And I raised a question at one of their meetings indicating that it might be more appropriate to go after Cheney, since, first of all, he may be more impeachable, and since if you did impeach Bush, you'd be left with Cheney, which would be worse, thrown out of the room. The World Can't Wait people have all sorts of overlapping links with LaRouche. One of those overlapping links is this guy, Les Jameson. He spells his last name J-A-M, as in Mary, I-E-S-O-N. He's also linked up with something called Urantia, U-R-A-N-T-I-A, which is some kind of a pseudo-Christian cult. World Can't Wait comes out of something which is typical LaRouche. It comes out of a group called the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was a group started by an African-American man, I think his name was Dix, D-I-X, who openly indicated very clearly that democracy does not work. The only way to achieve social progress is through violence.
Oh, boy.
Precisely what LaRouche did, particularly when he was involved with the Trotskyites and the Maoists. It's a very Maoist approach to politics, Democracy does not work, even though you use the language of democracy, etc. So, but World Can't Wait is something you might want to look into. There's also, by the way, a group called the Freedom Socialist Party. Here again, you see the word socialist. The Freedom Socialist Party is also on the way out left fringe. They're connected with this man, Jeffrey Blank, that I mentioned to you. Jeffrey, by the way, is spelled Geoffrey. Blank, who was involved in an assault on me. He became involved in a group called the No Police State Coalition, which is a group I'm connected with, which is basically a free speech group that used to run, it still does run, speak-outs in Union Square until Mr. Blank tried to take him over and started threatening people. And when somebody asked him about his links to LaRouche, he wouldn't say, he refused to talk. At any rate, it turns out that he's linked with a group called the Freedom Socialist Party, which has a radical left. They're based in Seattle and in Harlem. It was, again, I very rarely refer to the New York Post as a news source because it's basically a mouthpiece for Bush and for Rupert Murdoch, but every once in a while they come up with a good story. And I read with great interest how the Freedom Socialist Party was being investigated by a number of international intelligence agencies because of direct links to terrorism in Iraq. And when I called the group one day to find out about their relationship with Jeffrey Blank, the phone was answered by a man by the name of Stephen Durham, who slammed the phone down on me. And then when Stephen Durham was quoted in the New York Post, he was quoted as literally condoning the hostage beheadings perpetrated by that guy Zarqawi, who we finally nailed. Remember, he used to hold people up, captives, and then he would chop their heads off in public, like they did with Daniel Pearl. And this guy was asked, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, I can understand why they do that. And this is a group that is part of the left fringe, and they have LaRouche people in there too. So they're kind of ubiquitous, more ubiquitous than most people would feel, and that's why I'm sort of on this media campaign. I've talked to people in other news. Let me tell you one thing. One of the reasons, and I admire your willingness to do this, because many media people are afraid. LaRouche has vented some of his worst violence on media people. One of the reasons he came after me is because I write a newspaper, okay? He did this very famous story. He also goes after the conservatives in whenever it was, during a New Hampshire primary. I don't know when it was. The Manchester Union Leader, which is a very classically conservative paper, wrote something critical about him. A few days later, 4 guys go into the Manchester offices, LaRouche people, and they catch the editor alone in their room, and they say, you ever write this kind again, you're going to find your legs broken, Tony Soprano style. So many media people, even though they all recognize that this is a very dangerous man, are reluctant to go after him because he responds with threats, he responds with violence. You have to be careful. So, although years ago, when he was on trial in Boston in the 1980s, it got huge coverage. I still remember on the day he was convicted, it was a front-page lead story in the New York Times. After he was convicted, he was placed in a penitentiary up near Boston, and then because they wanted to get him as remote as possible, because they were afraid of his links with the Klan and all this other stuff, they sent him up to Rochester, Minnesota, and I still remember on the front page of the Times, a manacled LaRouche being transferred from one plane to another. So I would like to see him get the coverage, the negative and honest coverage that he deserves, and I'm working on that. But it's not easy to do. Many papers, there's been a lot of coverage on Miss Falani, okay? She's a very well-known figure. She ran for president. She's run for governor. She's run for everything, okay? She runs from me. When she sees me, she turns the other way. And she's very prominent here. She's a major political player. She knows Sharpton. She knows them all. She's made an outreach to Barack Obama, but they've told me, well, we know about her. We'll be very careful with her. She's tight with Bloomberg, although when she makes blatantly anti-racist statement, he gets very uncomfortable, okay? And this, by the way, this becomes relevant again, because Bloomberg is now being hoisted as a potential unifying, bipartisan candidate. Let me tell you, if this guy becomes president, he will owe something to Lenora Falani because he could not have become a mayor without her. To me, that is very, very scary. This woman is a blazing Jew hater, all right? And recently, because it came to exposure, she began to say, well, I didn't really mean what I said. Okay, this lady was also, she took a secret trip when Libya was blowing planes out of the sky. She took a secret trip to Libya with Gaddafi and was seen in some room, possibly with some Al-Qaeda people, okay? So, and this is important because she remains relevant, and if Bloomberg would owe her something, okay? And to me, but what people do not know is, you could write about Fulani, they do not know the Fulani-LaRouche link. They don't. I'm one of the first to write about it. Dennis King has been writing about it. You go to that Dennis King website, it'll knock your eyeballs out, okay? And it's her. She's much less visible now than when I started writing about her. And she's much less visible now when I started writing about Dennis King writing about her. But she's still out there. She's still out there. So, but the LaRouche thing is always, LaRouche is very, very smart. He knows when to stay in the background, and then he knows when to come out. He comes out on his webcasts. He's got webcasts all over the country. And I don't think he would dare set foot in New York. He lives in Leesburg, Virginia, which is a very short helicopter ride. I still think he has this fantasy of somehow everything's, I'll tell you what my most outlandish fear is, which is that given the number of people who despise George Bush, that something happens to that man, and that Cheney becomes president, and that the Cheney-LaRouche link, which I think is real, somehow LaRouche gets into that government.
Wow.
It's scary, and given Bush's blunderings, and given the fact of how he has infuriated so many people, I think he's one of the worst presidents in history, but I want that man
yeah.
presidency because I don't want to see Cheney and his underground pal LaRouche getting any closer to that White House. That's my worst fear. I don't think that's going to happen. So, but I think LaRouche is a specter looming there. And let me also tell you, this is his last shot. This guy's 80 years old, but he's apparently in good health. And if you read his writings, he's very, very clear. He believes that he was destined to rule. And unlike other psychos who talk nonsense where you immediately think they're on some kind of a drug, he talks a very good game. He's an extremely articulate man. He's an expert on all sorts of subjects, including classical music. And people who even know that he's nuts, they say, well, I read his stuff. It doesn't sound that bad, Sounds pretty good. So he has this veneer of rationality.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, we're right up at the hour. I'll get some closing statements from you guys, but as my way of wrapping it up, I mentioned at the beginning that Webster Tarpley just really builds the guy up, and it's hard to know what's...
When I asked him in public, he said, no, I'm not with LaRouche anymore. That's what he said, right there in front of 200 people at St. Mark's.
Well,
I'm not with LaRouche anymore.
Maybe this book was written before that.
And he's still with LaRouche. Once with LaRouche, always with LaRouche, unless you're willing to play some risks. One of the things is, people who separate from LaRouche run risks.
Wow.
Google onto Jeremiah Duggan, okay? Something went wrong, nobody was, but that boy wound up dead. He's not the first.
Wow.
You have to be very, very careful because it's a political cult. There's also a group, I think it's called the Nick Ross Institute, based in New Jersey, which monitors political cults. They've done a lot of work on LaRouche. It's not a standard political party. It's not a standard political organization. It's a cult. It involves total loyalty. You do not mess with that, Tarpley, I'm sure LaRouche instructs his people, listen, depending on your audience, you have to be careful what you say about me. If you're in front of some kind of liberal Jewish democratic audience, you better not say anything nice about me, okay? Anyway, so when I asked Tarpley, which was in front of a very mixed, hip New York City crowd down there at St. Mark's in the East Village, and I didn't even accuse him of anything. All I said was, it seems that there's a remarkable similarity of your view, as Wes Jameson came to pull me away from the mic, and he said, no, I'm not with LaRouche anymore. So, of course he's with LaRouche. He does, by the way, LaRouche's major operation, even though he's very active in New York, a lot of stuff in Europe, okay, a lot of stuff in Germany, a lot of stuff in Italy, etc., and where there are fewer African Americans to have to contend with, so he can use his white racist stuff over there very effectively and use his black racist stuff here. But it's all racist. The man is a racist through and through.
Wow, this is real.
About his childhood. His childhood was weird too, not unlike Adolf Hitler's. Anyway.
Wow, it's just mysterious guy.
Yeah, he's serious, and I'm really glad that you're giving this the coverage it deserves, and I'm going to keep on going. I'm hoping that perhaps NBC News or perhaps one of the papers, I've talked a little bit with the Staten Island Advance, which is not one of your more adventurous papers in New York, but it's a paper that took me a long time. I got covered when I ran for the Senate. Because there are some LaRouche people here in Staten Island, and I've talked to a number of reporters, and what they usually say is, keep me informed let me know what's going on, because then they try to push with their editors to get some coverage in it, So I'm just hoping that somebody, maybe yourself, somebody should contact Ralph Nader. His press guy's Kevin Zeese. If Ralph Nader will probably say no comment. Let me just add this. I know how much time I have. Ralph Nader spoke and he knows me. He did a book signing a few months ago over at Barnes & Noble at Union Square. And several people asked him, of course, well, what do you plan? Are you thinking of running, et cetera, in 2008? And he wisely said, well, it's too early to say. And he said a few nice words about Dennis Kucinich and then a few nice words about John Edwards, et cetera. And then he made it a point not to call on me, but at the right time I piped up and said, well, what's the story? I thought he wouldn't talk about it. He will not talk about Lenore Fulani. This is a guy who likes to talk about anything. And why he won't talk about her? Because they don't want to talk about anything even remotely linking them with Lyndon LaRouche. I told him about this in 1996 when I met him up in Rochester, because the LaRouche people were on his campaign like gnats. And he didn't know about it. And it's very understandable, because they are disguised. If you hear your typical LaRouche person, it sounds like they get into the environment. They sound like your regular leftist, environmentalist, civil rights, etc. It's one of the greatest camouflages in history.
Real chameleons, yeah. Well, Tom, tell us again what your website is and what people can find there.
Sure. And maybe church website too. Anyway, my website, I publish Upfront News, which is available in New York in print, not at the newsstands. It's through the movement, whatever. And the website there is www.tomsupfrontnews.blogspot.com. Tom's Upfront News is one word without an apostrophe. There's also a sort of companion website from the days when I was running as a independent Democratic write-in candidate for the Senate. It was against Hillary, although I had a lot of enemies.
Yeah, but
including the LaRouche people. And that website and there's a great deal of information if you're interested in the LaRouche thing on the LaRouche, because I was being hassled by the LaRouche people left and right. And that website is at www.tomweissdemocratforUSSenate.blogspot.com. Again, Tom Weiss is with two S's, no dots between the U and the S. And those are my websites, and I've also been covered, by the way, in some of the media. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. I broke a big scandal years ago, and I got all sorts of coverage in Newsday. And so if you Google Staten Island Advance, you'll probably get a copy of their story about me. And I've been on this very interesting radio show, by the way, here called It's called Conversations with Harold Channer. I'd like to get Reverend Carolina onto that show. Harold Channer is a talk show host who thrives on the First Amendment, and he interviews all sorts of people. He's interviewed Gaddafi, and he's interviewed me. He's interviewed Jeffrey Blank, and he might interview Lyndon LaRouche. He's basically a very independent-minded man. And he runs this show which is broadcast on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and also all of the internet. If you go to haroldchanner.tv, I think you'll find it. And I talked about LaRouche with him, etc. But my main vehicle is through my own newspaper and my website.
And Pastor Carolina, what's his website?
It would be www.firstcentralbaptistchurch.org.
That's in Staten Island, New York.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for being here today.